So thank you so much. Hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end to chat with her about some of these issues one-on-one. And Olivia, thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy Women in Medicine Month to everyone last couple days here. I'm very interested to hear specifically what the women doctors, if they've read my book, what the feedback is, what they thought of the book. I've heard from a lot of actually young women in medical school who have recently chosen to go to medical school who wrote to me and said how meaningful the book was to them and how inspiring it was to kind of see these early experiences, the women that paved the way, the trailblazers that kind of, you know, they're the reason that these young women can go to medical school freely now alongside men of all things. So today, you know, jumping off from there, when a young woman announces that she wants to become a doctor, it's like it's a perfect thing, right? It's an awesome thing. It's not a sad thing. It's not like a, oh no, what have you done thing. It's the best, right? It's like shorthand for impressing your parents, right? It's all you get is congratulations and admiration and great job. But back in the day, that wasn't the case. If I can get the next slide here, let's see. Oh, there we go. Well, I guess I'll just ask for the next slide when I need it. So yeah, we were getting the exact opposite reaction in the Victorian era. These first women who said they wanted to become doctors. They were met with you know, huge emotional reactions from their families. That, you know, it was like the worst thing they could have done to say, I want to become a doctor. This was considered grotesque, you know, and at the time maybe that was probably, yeah, medicine was a little bit gross. But yeah, they were considered traitors to their gender, that they were interested in science, that they were interested in like poking around inside bodies, you know, that was something men did, and they were masculinizing themselves by their interest in medicine, their interest in wanting to study to become a doctor. They faced societal scorn for these choices, and they faced social ostracism. But the worst to me was the getting ousted from their families. You know, a lot of these families disowned these women when they said, I want to become a doctor. So I have a few on the next slide. I have a few examples. Most of these people aren't in my book. This first woman is, she's amazing. But I just wanted to share a couple little anecdotes that I found about these early women who told their families, I want to become a doctor, and then what transpired. So Marie Zakshevska, she graduated from medical school in 1856, and she told her dad all about it. And her dad wrote back to say, she was in America at this point, and he was still in Europe. But her dad wrote back to tell her that if she was his son, that he would be only satisfied and proud and, you know, only good feelings. But because she was his daughter, all he could do was grieve and weep. So it was grievous, you know, this was a sad, horrible thing to him that his doctor had earned an MD. And she was one of the earliest in America. Eliza Mosher, she told her parents she wanted to be a doctor, and her mother told her she'd sooner see her in a lunatic asylum than in medical school. So that, you know, that's, you know, there's no family support going on here, going into this new world. So next slide, please. So now we have Rosalie Slaughter Morton. Her two brothers were both doctors, but they were a very wealthy family. And so her parents were appalled at the idea of a woman earning money, having a job. This was not okay. Women didn't need jobs. Their husbands had jobs. So she had to wait until her father died before she could enroll in medical school. But she did. She went on to pursue her dream. Having a doctor for a daughter caused Bertha Van Heusen's mother to burst out crying every time the topic came up. So her father refused to pay her medical school tuition. But, as you can see, all of these women did eventually go on to become first, make a lot of inroads in medicine. So despite, their families refusing to pay for things, refusing to support them. So when the final one is Lizzie Garrett, this anecdote, and she is one of the main characters of my book. When she announced her aspirations to become a doctor, her mother flew into a month-long depressive episode. She got sick from crying too much. She was constantly crying because of this. She eventually came around and was supportive, and would send her like hampers of food and stuff at her medical practice. But and her father actually became one of her biggest supporters. She would go talk to someone on the medical, where the medical practices were down the street, and they'd be like, "Oh no, what are you thinking? You can't become a doctor." And then he would go around with her and be like, "Why are you telling her this? She can do whatever she wants." So it was really interesting to watch his, coming around to this idea as well. So those are just a few of the stories. Most of those are in the book, but I wanted to share those because they were great. If I could get the next slide. So when I was researching my book, Women in White Coats, How the First Women Doctors Changed the World of Medicine. And this is the hardback and the paperback American version. And then the next slide after this is the UK version, which is coming out in a few weeks. I think it's in October. Getting UK publication. The other one is the Polish version. And I also have a Chinese and a Italian version coming. But the Polish version is called like Amongst the Brutes or something like that. It's a quote from one of the main characters. They said that the title as it was wouldn't really translate for Polish, so they picked something else. But I really like that Among the Brutes because I think it encapsulates a lot. It's a very intense cover there with the red. I think it's been well received since publication there. So next slide, please. So my book is about 3 of the first women to earn Western medical degrees. Elizabeth Blackwell is the first woman MD practicing in America. Lizzie Garrett Anderson is the first licensed woman practicing as a physician in England. And Sophia Jex-Blake was the first woman MD practicing in Scotland. So they struggled through so many sexist roadblocks along the way and became a sort of band of unlikely friends, if you will. I don't know if you can really call them friends. They're professional colleagues, maybe. Sophia and Lizzie Garrett actually knew each other before Sophia decided to become a doctor. Sophia was helping her in her trying to get into schools and trying to talk to administrators and that kind of thing. So they were more friends perhaps than with Elizabeth Blackwell. But together, eventually, they founded the first women's medical school in the UK, the London School of Medicine for Women, which got folded into University College London, and doesn't really exist today, but it's close. So I like to say my book is as infuriating as it is inspiring, because it's as much about these women's perseverance as it is about the sexism and misogyny thrown in their way for daring to defy these societal norms and the status quo. They had really had everything going against them and very little support. Next slide, please. So I got the idea for this book. This is like the first question everybody asks when they get me on for you. Where did you come up with this idea? So as I'm writing my second book now, I'm like thinking about how to answer this question. The question everyone had. So I was reading an essay, I think it was in Lapham's or something, I can't remember now, but I was reading about 2 different riots. They were like, had these really eerie similarities. They were like basically the same thing. One was in Philadelphia, outside where I live, and one was in Edinburgh, where I lived for a couple of years outside of, after I graduated from high school. So I was really intrigued by these, the locations of both of these. So both of them were cases where women were going into these male spaces of medical school and trying to get an education. And because they dared to enter the classroom, they got a lot of vile response. So the first one on Saturday, November 6th, 1869, 30 students from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania arrived at the Pennsylvania Hospital for a clinical lecture that was co-ed. So the students from the surrounding colleges, the male students, have been allowed to come to these clinical lectures for years and years and years. And the Women's Medical College had been applying to come for many, many years, and they kept saying no, kept saying no. They had been allowed to come once before this, many years before. And the professor was just livid. So they shut it down. They weren't allowed to come back. So finally, the same administrator has been there, and she's like years and years and years of constantly begging basically this hospital to allow these women to come. Like, we need clinical education. We need this. We can't, this is something we can't provide. These women need this as part of their education. You have to let us come. So finally they said yes. So word about these women coming had gotten out. And so there's like a note being passed around among the male medical students that said, come and see the she doctors. So when the women got there to the lecture, there was so many more students than would normally have been there. There's about 300 students. And they walk into the amphitheater and they just start like screaming and hissing and stomping. They were, yelling nasty names at them. They're catcalling them. They were flinging spitballs, tobacco juice wads. It was, it was gross. They were just being really foul. And these women had to take it. They had to show no reaction. Basically, they couldn't like run away. They couldn't fight back at all. They had to just, be fully stoic and say, okay, this isn't going to scare us away. We're going to stay here and we're going to attend this lecture. So throughout, the professors are trying to get through this lecture, and occasionally, noises come up and they start screaming again, and there's like a flash of a thigh or something of the patient, and so like yelling starts again, and they have administrators running in and going, okay guys, you got to stop this isn't cool, we're trying to get through this lecture. And they like chase them out at the end and like really chasing them home. It was a nightmare. All they were trying to do was get a medical education that was just as good as the men's education, but they saw it as, women infiltrating this male space, their male domain. So this is called the Jeering episode. As you can see, there's really some really interesting press coverage. They quote some of the men that were there. They quote some of the women that were there. I wrote a whole separate piece on this. This was a whole like section of the book that I cut out. And so I wrote like a feature on Science News website called What I Left Out. And so there's an essay on this episode that I put in there because I really wanted to write about it because it was so nearby. And there's just so much great saved in the archive about it. So next slide, please. Almost exactly a year later, in Edinburgh, Scotland, we have a drunken mob awaiting with top hats. I don't know. This is a later painting of rendering of what this might look like. No, so we have a drunken mob. They're drinking and they're singing. They're waiting for these women who were coming to take a co-ed exam at the University of Edinburgh. They've been, at the school for a couple of years, but this is like one of the first times that they've had an exam with men and women together, right? The women had been in some classes with other men, but not a lot. This was just one of the times that they decided that, the surrounding community was going to kind of make their voice known. Basically, because it wasn't all students that were waiting for them. It was some local people as well. So the men threw mud and trash at them. They threw rotten eggs and rotten produce at the women. In the book, I imagine them having like, mud caked dresses when they're going in to this exam. They a few male students helped them get safely into the exam room. So they try to sit and take this exam while they're outside. There's this ruckus going on, and the men actually later let a sheep into the exam room as well. But there were there was a few of the male students that helped them get home safely as well. There were groups that were also chasing them down the streets. So seeing what these women were going through, just for trying to study medicine, that was my first reading about any of this, and I had to know more, I had to know everything. I just was like, if this is what is easily read about online, then what else is there? What is in the archive? What am I going to find when I go in? And what I found was those experiences I shared at the beginning, which is, their parents basically disowning them for what they decided, and so many stories. I could not, I couldn't get over how many stories there were about riots. I just mentioned these two riots. There's another one at a clinical lecture in New York. There's a separate incident. Talk about the women who went to lecturing, they got catcalled and stuff. So I just really wanted to dig further and see. I wanted to find out everything I could. I wanted to know everything about what these women went through. Next slide, please. So at the beginning of the book, there's a preface about how women, the Victorian women that I talk about, were not the first women physicians in the world, right? There was women physicians, women surgeons in ancient Greece, ancient Egypt. We know the names of some of these women. So, it's a book about some of the first women to get Western MDs. I wanted to be very specific about that. It's, there were ancient healers in all over the world that were women. So a patriarchal control swept in around the Middle Ages era. Medicine was transformed into a profession that you needed a university education, you needed licensure. It was like an official thing now. And then throughout Europe, they started to vilify lay women healers and started burning them at the stake as witches. So we kind of like have a whole period of eradication of women healers. So I wanted to show how women were trying to recapture what they had before, which they're trying to officially re-enter the realm of medicine with official degrees. So women in the Victorian era were viewed as weak imitations of men. Probably even earlier than that was this idea that women are like men, but lesser, right? So women's place was in the home. Like women, their domain was the private, and men had the public, and that was not gonna mix, and that's just how it was. Doctors often made up reasons to keep women in their place. One of the most popular theories at the time was that engaging in really difficult mental or physical labor, especially during your period, would render you feeble-minded and sterile. So then you couldn't go on and have these babies that you were supposed to have. Like that was, your role was to have babies. And if you went to college, you would use up all your life force, all your energy on your brain instead of on your womb, and you dry up your womb and you wouldn't be able to have kids. So next slide, please. So this is, my book is infuriating for one of the reasons is that it details the poor treatment that many women experience at the hands of male doctors. Women's illnesses were very misunderstood. The etiology of where these women's illnesses were coming from. It really didn't care about actually out what was going on, right? They just thought, you have this uterus and that's what's making you sick. It's because you're a woman, you're sick. And many of the women who wanted to become doctors also were driven to because they had watched someone in their family, usually a mother, sister, aunt, some female relative. They had watched them kind of suffer through an illness or die a really slow, horrible, painful death because they either one didn't want to consult a male doctor, or two, their doctor was really just making their pain worse. they were made even more uncomfortable by whatever the doctor was doing, which, you know, at the time is not really a surprise because it wasn't a lot they could do. And a lot of the medicines they had were, you know, were going to make it worse. They were toxic, they were heavy metals, they weren't really going to cure you. So I discovered that a lot of these women also had personal experiences or a sister or themselves as having a difficult pregnancy, having a stillbirth, having an infant loss, and that's what inspired them to become a doctor. So that made me feel a really strong kinship and connection with these women, because when I was pregnant the first time, I almost died and gave birth, and my son almost died, and I had terrible postpartum depression afterward. And so it was having that experience that made me switch. I was an arts journalist, and that experience made me switch over to women's health and women's history. So I really acutely understood what it meant for this life experience to really radically change what you wanted out of life and what you wanted out of your career, what you wanted to do with your time. So these women wanted to widen their opportunities. You know, they didn't just want to be a teacher. They didn't just want to be a writer. There's really nothing else you could do as a woman, right? You're supposed to go from your dad's house to your husband's house and stay home. And if you never got married, you were just going to be a teacher, basically. That was it. We weren't really seeing like young women wanting to become nurses just yet this era. There's a lot of like these first women that went through medical school describe the women nurses at the hospital as like gruff older women. A lot of them are like drunk. This is not like the cool young hip, you know, career that we think of it as now, maybe, or even a few, maybe about a decade after this, like when Florence Nightingale came through. That's really what we started to see, the women aspiring to be this young, selfless, you know, savior on the battlefield. And, you know, this nursing became this heroic thing, almost romantic kind of career, right? After Florence Nightingale. Elizabeth Blackwell is actually friends with Florence Nightingale, which was really interesting reading their letters. So these women, you know, they didn't think that men should be the ones going out and changing the world and having all the fun. Some of them didn't want to get married. Some of them didn't like men. They didn't, you know, they didn't want to get married, but or they maybe no one asked them to get married. Maybe they wanted to stay with a woman. So next slide, please. So each of the women that the three women that I profile had really different characters. Elizabeth was the oldest by many years. She was the first, and it wasn't until like a decade after she got her degree that Lizzie and Sophia really even entered the picture. Lizzie actually started wanting to become a doctor by reading this profile that Elizabeth Blackwell's sister had written her in a women's journal that was in England. And then Elizabeth had come over for like a lecture tour, and Lizzie went to go see her and talk to her about this. You know, she kind of, Elizabeth was what sparked Lizzie interest in becoming a doctor in the first place. So yeah, we have a bit of an age gap going in here. Elizabeth Blackwell is very eccentric, very aesthetic. They didn't have a lot of money. She had to work as a teacher for many years to earn enough money to go to medical school. She's really odd. The more I researched her, she's still a really odd person. She adopted a daughter because she was lonely. Her daughter was kind of like almost like a housemaid type thing. It was a very bizarre relationship. Their daughter like called her by her first name. I mean, it's not weird at the time for your daughter to have been doing a lot of housework, but it seemed like a much more formal arrangement that I don't know. I thought Elizabeth was a little odd. Where Elizabeth was very plain, we have Lizzie, who comes from a much wealthier family. She wanted to make a point of being seen wearing lacy, fancy dresses at parties, the society in England was much more accepting of her socially than the society in New York was of Elizabeth. Elizabeth was very lonely. Elizabeth did not make a lot of money at first. She struggled with her practice. She had to ration coal and food at one point. But here we have Lizzie, her family sending her hampers of food from their, their big estate. So she's, a kind of a cool invite to a dinner party, right? Because she's a doctor.
Olivia, I don't know if you can hear me, but I think we're having a little bit of an audio disruption. Can you hear me okay?
Can you hear me at all?
Oh, there we go. Now I can hear you. Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Maybe just
Okay,
back
I'm
up
sorry
a
about
sentence
that.
or two. No, we can hear you perfectly now. Thank you.
Yeah. This social idea that studying medicine is going to masculinize you, like only masculine women want to study medicine or interested in something like that. So she was really going the other way almost and putting out the ultra feminine look of lace and lavish and fancy, and she wanted to be seen as a demure lady, who was also a doctor. Lizzie got married and had 3 kids, and she even performed surgery while she was pregnant. So the last one is Sophia Jex Blake. She was my favorite character. I don't know, I think everyone has a different favorite character that I've talked to about this book, but Sophia was great. She was fat, she was opinionated, she was loudmouth, she was a lesbian. She had a terrible temper and a brilliant mind, and she just seemed to fall in love with every young, passionate, independent woman that she ran across. There's several different women in the book that she's dates throughout her time. There's her first love kind of is always haunting her, and then she goes to America and meets this other woman doctor, and she's like really wants to settle down with her, but her father gets ill and she has to come back to the UK, and she finally, much later in life, meets another woman, and they move in together and become life partners, and that's, she's settled for the rest of her life with this woman. So very mercurial, just a really fascinating character, just fun character to write, honestly. So the story really also became about putting aside differences and working together for the greater good, because these women were so different. They really didn't get along at times. They had very different ideas about how to achieve their goals. So I like to think that the book illustrates how women are not a monolith, even within smaller movements. I didn't want to say, oh, everyone had the same idea and they're all working toward this goal, but that wasn't the case. They had fights about different, medical ideas. Elizabeth didn't like surgery. She was from a, much earlier era where, they didn't have ways to knock you out for surgery. She thought that poking around in your abdomen and taking out organs and stuff was like just the worst thing ever. Whereas these younger women, Lizzie and Sophia and other women, they were like, no, this is like the next frontier. We need to be doing this, and this is really important. It's, you've never seen diseased ovaries before, if you're telling us that you don't think things should be taken out of the body. So there was medical arguments. There was arguments about what they needed to do to really achieve social acceptance of women doctors, and they fought a lot about it. So Elizabeth and Lizzie, they wanted a slow and steady road to acceptance. They didn't want to bulldoze men's toes. They knew that they had to partner with men, that they couldn't afford to totally alienate them. They needed their help. Basically, they needed, the slow path to approval that included them. But Sophia, she did not care at all what men thought of her. So she did not care about men's toes. She was like, no, why I shouldn't have to wait for men to get used to this idea. Well, that's not fair. How long is it going to take anyway? She said whatever she wanted. She said what was on her mind, because she didn't care what men thought of her. She didn't care what their opinion was of her. I felt like she was the true agitator of the group. Her outspoken impatience did a lot more to propel their movement than most people realize today, because this demeanor also rendered her very unpopular with a lot of other women in the movement. This temperament was a liability to them rather than an asset. And several organizations that she founded, that she spearheaded, she was pushed out of because they didn't feel like she would be the best advocate for the group. It was very sad. I feel like if she better fit the mold of what society thinks women should be, how they should behave, that she'd be better remembered. Honestly, I think if she wasn't a fat, angry lesbian, that we would celebrate her more, like we do Lizzie. Like I think a lot of more people in the UK know Elizabeth Garrett. Elizabeth Garrett is named after. There's a lot of things named after her in the UK. She's very celebrated because she was very, womanly. She fit that mold of she's a mother and she's a doctor. She's, a good wife and she's feminine. And, that's what history likes to celebrate. They like the women that fit into that mold. I think without Sophia, we would have taken a lot longer to get to society accepting women doctors. She really pushed the envelope where others were not ready to do so yet. So these three women all took very different paths to earn their MDs. Elizabeth was turned down by dozens of schools. She applied to basically every medical school in America. One of her mentors said, you should go to France and dress as a man and just get a medical degree there. And she was like, no, that would really defeat the purpose of a woman getting a medical degree. She wanted to be the first woman to earn an MD, and that wouldn't be the case if she was pretending to be a man in France. I honestly think that it could have been any career that Elizabeth Blackwell picked. I think she could have been anything. She just really wanted to be the first to do something. She wanted to be a woman in a man's world and make that mark. But she was finally accepted to a smaller, what they called a country medical school in Geneva, New York. And it was actually sort of a joke that she was accepted at all. So it was Elizabeth's mentor who had, sent her letter of recommendation to this school, and the administrator was a friend of his, and he didn't want to be the one to say, oh no, we can't accept a woman. So he said the students should be allowed to decide whether she gets admitted or not. So he goes to the students like, hey, should we let this woman come be a student? And they think it's a practical joke from a nearby rival school. So they're like, oh, sure, yeah, she could totally come. A few weeks later, this real woman appears, in the classroom, and they're kind of stunned, but they eventually sort of take her in as an older sister type. She had a lot less sexism in her medical school experience than the other women. I think it was because it was a much smaller school and more of a tighter knit group. She was the first MD in America in 1849. But as soon as she graduated, Geneva College didn't let any other women come in. They closed their doors to further women because of the level of scrutiny they received thanks to her. Now over in the UK, which is where Lizzie and Sophia are, many of the medical schools are attached to hospitals, so like teaching hospitals. So Lizzie was able to be a nurse and take some classes. So she would go work as a nurse at a hospital, and then she'd be like, hey, can I take this class? And I'm like, okay, sure. Like, hey, can I take another class? So she kept getting kicked out of these different schools, different hospitals, the more she pushed, and the more she was like adding more and more, because they kind of got wise to what she was trying to do, and they're like, no, you're not going to do that. So one of the schools she went to, the students petitioned for her to get removed because she kept scoring higher than them. And she actually published about one of the cases in the hospital in a medical journal, and they didn't think that was fair, that she, was doing better than they were. So she wasn't really able to earn an MD just yet. She does later on, but she kind of just finishes out her prerequisites with private teachers, private tutors, instructors that she's met through these hospitals that agree to come to her house and, finish teaching her everything she needs to meet the prerequisites to take the Society of Apothecaries exam, which will then basically certify you to practice medicine. It's not an MD, but it's a license to practice. So she passed the exam and was licensed. And as soon as she was licensed, the apothecaries decided to change their wording and make sure no other women could come back and do the same. So you're seeing the theme here. As soon as someone gets through a crack, they close it up real fast. So any woman that was like, oh hey, I'm going to go follow that path and go do what she just did, well, it wasn't possible because it closed right behind her. So a few years later, Lizzie went and took her MD exams at the Sorbonne in Paris. It's the only place that she could find that would allow her in Europe. Now Sophia is pretty well known in the UK because she was part of the Edinburgh Seven who were involved in the riot. So she first approached the University of Edinburgh Medical School, and they were like, oh, we can't take you on as a student because we'd have to have a whole separate class for you because you're a woman and there's only one of you, so we can't afford, financially, it doesn't make any sense for us to have a class for one woman, so go away. She goes and finds this newspaper editor friend, and he publishes an article about how she's looking for more people, more women to come join her. Little crusade. And so all these women come. So now she has 7 women from all over the UK have come over and said, okay, we want to apply with you. So now that the excuse that the university gave the first time, it's kind of out the window, right? So they can't say you're only one woman because now she's got more than one woman. So they're like, okay, fine, they have to say yes. So they allow them to matriculate, but they say that they're not really compelled or required to technically to teach them. So a lot of times they were just like handed the textbooks for the class and said, go at it, figure it out yourself, kind of thing. So they had to teach themselves a lot of things, but despite that, a lot of these women were getting top scores on the exams, were scoring much higher than the men, which of course the men loved. So they spent several years and finally got all the requirements they needed for a medical degree at the University of Edinburgh. They go to school and say, okay, we're done, we're ready to graduate. And they're like, no, we're not giving you your degree. They'd done everything that the men had done to earn degrees, but just because they're women, they would not get their degrees. And actually, I think it was 2019, they were awarded posthumous degrees from the University of Edinburgh, which is, it's great to recognize, but I was too little, way too late. Those professors were just so horrible to them at the school, and just every chance they got. There was one of the professors who just was railing in medical publications about how this is just the worst thing ever, that women were in medical school, they needed to be in school by themselves, they didn't belong alongside men. It was like the end of morality as we knew it. So it wasn't just the students that were taking part in these riots. A lot of the professors and administrators joined in, and a lot of them had no qualms telling them to their faces that they didn't think they belonged there. All right, next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight the, seemingly insurmountable sexist opposition these women had to overcome, but I also wanted to remember that there were a few men who, helped them along. There were professors and fellow students and physicians that were helping them as mentors, as, colleagues. So it wasn't, all men versus women. There really were some men that were helping them along the way. And also that women, it wasn't that all women were approving of women becoming doctors either. There was several instances where they would go for fundraising and go to like these wealthy women and be like, oh, absolutely not. I'm not donating to women doctors. I would never go to a woman doctor. Are you crazy? So there was internalized sexism among women. There was women that were just as invested in this patriarchy as men were. So they were fighting against these stereotypes and myths of what women could be and could do, just to try to be seen as equals that were just as capable of any career as men. This is these on the screen here are these cartoons in the Punch magazine in the UK. There's another one that I didn't include. It was like women doctors mean like men would come to them and have problems with the heart. They were falling in love, and it was just anything they could think of to make fun of the idea of women doctors. One of them really see, next slide, please. So one really interesting thing. Oh wait, go back. There we go. One really interesting thing I read about was that almost all of these women had this moment in their training where they were very worried that how they were going to react to a dissection, their first surgeries, the first experience of inside the human body. They've been so conditioned by society, this that they weren't ready for this, that they couldn't handle this. They, almost all of them admitted or talked about in diaries about how they were worried they were going to faint, or that they what was going to happen. And after it happened, almost all of them talked about how it wasn't disgusting, that they found actually the inner workings of the human body. The more they learned about it, the more exquisite it was, and how it was just delicate and complicated and really beautiful. So I thought that was really interesting that almost all of these women talked about that, and they really were ready for it. They weren't as squeamish as they really feared. So when it came time for after graduation, find a job, well, no one wants to hire a woman doctor, right? No hospital, no doctor's practice, they're not getting hired anywhere. All three of these women had to establish their own private practices. And a lot of times business was very slow at first. Eventually, the more that word got out, practices started booming. So next slide, please. So all three women oversaw the expansion of their little medical practices, private practices, into women's hospitals. A lot of them were women and children hospitals. So these were hospitals run by women for women, which is very radical. And then we have Emily Blackwell, Elizabeth's little sister, who, along with Marie Zakshevska, they all found the Women's Hospital in New York, and then Emily and Elizabeth at a medical college for women, and then Elizabeth just off to London to start another medical college for women. So next slide, please. So we have Lizzie founds a women's hospital in London. Then we have the wards on the outside, and then we have Sophia founds a women's hospital in Scotland, in Edinburgh, Scotland, which later became the Bruntsfield Hospital, which was around for a very long time. So being an independent woman didn't really give you a lot of marriage proposals most of the time. But Elizabeth never got married. Sophia did have a lesbian partner with a fellow doctor who was much younger. And then there was Lizzie, who actually got 4 marriage proposals. And one of the marriage proposals actually married her younger sister instead. But the man she did marry, they had a very progressive relationship. He was very, very approving of her working. She kind of had to be the proof that you could do it all. You'd have it all as a woman. And one of her children passed away. She had 3 children, and 2 of them survived into adulthood. And her daughter actually became a physician herself and a surgeon. And her daughter was one of the pioneers of the idea of women treating male patients, which obviously didn't happen in Lizzie's lifetime. So next slide, please. So my original book proposal had a lot more women in it. I really wanted to have a lot of the stories of those women in Philadelphia, because they were so close by. But I actually sent out the book with their stories in it as well, and got the universal feedback that this was too much. There was too many going in too many directions. There were too many people in it. So I really needed to hone in on what I was trying to say. So I had to refocus. So next slide, please. Oh, there's, I skipped those slides, sorry. There's Lizzie and her husband, James. That's their engagement photo. They're not even touching each other. And that's Lizzie and her daughter, Louisa. Louisa wrote a biography of Lizzie that was very, very helpful to my research. And she mentioned how her mother was not very maternal. She really hated the noise of children playing, and just it was good that she had had a nanny to hire. But yeah, I mean, she loved them in her own way. She wasn't like standoffish or cruel or anything. She just kind of didn't know what to do with them when they were little, I guess. I think a lot more women experience that than admit to it. All right, next slide. This is me, and no, it's not really. There's just so much. I did so much research for this, and for my next book, I have even more research, and I feel like even more overwhelmed. This is me right now with my book number 2, live footage of me. So I read all the primary documents I could. A lot of the archival documents had been digitized, so I got to go travel, which was fun because it was the fall before COVID, October, I think, 2019. I got to jet around New York, London, Edinburgh, poke around in archives. It was so much fun. Next slide. It was very exciting to hold these letters that these women had written themselves, like to imagine them sitting there writing it. I panicked about, what if I ruin this? What happens if I get a nosebleed? Like what? I'm just convinced I'm just gonna tear this, paper up that's been around for 150 years. It was fine, everything was fine. But I tried to approach the research like a journalist, which is what my training is in. So when you write a profile of someone as a journalist, you interview that person, you interview their friends, relatives, their enemies, you read any press accounts of them. So I was able to find a lot of books, essays, letters, diaries written by the women themselves, a lot of biographies and profiles written by sisters, by partners, by children. So there's a wealth of information out there. So I tried really hard to find as many good firsthand quotes as I could, and descriptions of conversations were gold mine, so I could create a scene It's really hard to do in historical nonfiction. I was very excited whenever I found those moments of really great quotes that told us not only about what this person was saying, but what they were like as a person. And I could put those people in a room and have some action going on. That's, really shakes up nonfiction. So one of the difficulties I ran into was that Sophia requested all of her papers be destroyed upon her death. It's a pretty common request for people. It's a lot of historians run into this. Her partner had written a biography of her that had included a lot of her diaries, entries, letters, large chunks of quotes. So that's where I found most of it. But after her partner wrote that book, she did destroy all the originals. And she actually took her own life after she wrote the biography. Sophia died, she wrote the biography, destroyed everything, and then she took her life. Sophia also published a lot of her own essays. She was very outspoken. She had a lot of pieces in medical journals and just essays about her experience. So it wasn't like there was nothing about her. There was a fair amount to find. Next slide, please. There's some of the archival things I found. Next slide. So I was really interested in balancing out the biography with the discussions of what medicine was like in the Victorian era. I didn't want it to be just biography, and I didn't want it to be just science. I kind of wanted you to see both of those topics through the eyes of each other, right? I wanted you to come away from the book kind of knowing what it was like to go see a doctor in the Victorian era. So, and it's a really, really incredible time in medicine, medical history. So we transfer from the early period where it's really, dark and brutal, bloodletting, purging, unmedicated surgery. Finally, next slide. Give way to the light of antisepsis, anesthesia, germ theory, medications that actually worked without poisoning you slowly. So it's a really, really fascinating history, this period of history that I got to poke around in, and you could see it through their eyes of these women. It's a great progression. What's really ironic is that because of all the sexism they came up upon, these early medical women had to travel to mainland Europe to achieve a lot of their postgraduate training or their undergraduate training also. So places like France, Germany, Switzerland, it's like where medical progress was happening during this time. So these women would go there and train and learn all these new techniques and cutting edge treatments and instruments and bring it back to the US and the UK. So yeah, it's funny that because they were shoved into another whole other continent, that they came back and brought all these amazing things with them. These women helped popularize preventative medicine, regular prenatal care and postnatal care, social workers, and antiseptic practices in the US and Britain. Right, next slide. So now that women could do science of their own, they could just start debunking these men's theories about their biology and dubious claims about why they were getting sick. They investigated the real culprits that they suspected were at the root of many women's illnesses, which were frequent pregnancies, heavy and restrictive clothing, unsafe working conditions in factories and domestic service, and sexist social norms that meant that men were encouraged to exercise, but women were not. Next slide. So no one could have blamed these early women for quitting at any time, given the constant sexism and lack of support. They chose not only to continue pursuing their goals, but to go even further and establish medical colleges just for women in hopes of ensuring these women who came after them didn't have to endure what they did. They proved, most of all, that women could be doctors, and great ones at that. I hope that hearing the history of what women had to endure to become doctors can help modern medical professionals realize the importance of continuing to advocate for more opportunities for women. This is my sad slide of how women are still underrepresented, underpaid, in medicine. There are more female medical students than men right now, but as you go up the educational ladder there, it goes way down, right? Leadership positions at universities and hospitals are very male dominated. There's several medical specialties that are still boys clubs, and there are still women doctors that experience sexism. So next slide, last slide. I like to think we owe it to these early trailblazers to do everything within our power to stamp out sexism in medicine. And that's it. I'm done.
Olivia, thank you so much. That was an amazing synopsis of an incredibly assiduously researched book that I learned a tremendous amount from. And you know, I could sit here and talk to you all afternoon about some of the points you've brought up in the book that you haven't even had time to represent here in your brief review of it. But, you know, some of I think the last slide, you know, with the ongoing disparities shows that we certainly still have some work to do, but, you know, so many other themes emerged from the book. You know, one thing that I thought was really fascinating, it probably is kind of intuitive that women would want to care for women and children in their careers, but some of the other areas where they were real trailblazers seem to me the areas of preventive health, willingness to care for minority patients who were spurned by traditional physicians, just so much more a free-thinking set of people.
They had some really radical ideas. Elizabeth Blackwell especially, she had some radical ideas about women's health care, about preventative medicine, about teaching mothers how to care for their children, and like encouraging young girls to get married later, to not get pregnant constantly, to exercise as young women. Like, these were really radical ideas at this time. It sounds, you know, weird now, but to advocate for things like this was crazy back then. And like, she was very into preventive medicine, and she was way ahead of her time in that sense, for sure. And yes, there was a riot, a race riot outside of her hospital, and all the white patients were like, you need to get rid of all these Black patients in the hospital. We can't be a target for this rioting. And she and Emily were like, absolutely not. That's not going to happen. We know whatever happens will happen, but they're staying put. You know, so it's the same time that, you know, white doctors in the South were, you know, doing horrible tests and on Black women slaves. At the same time, these women are in New York in the North and saying these women deserve medical care just like anybody else. You know, they were very radical in caring for Black women patients. The women's medical school is the one in Philadelphia. It accepted women of any race. It was one of the first places that Black women could go to medical school. So you see a lot of the first Black women doctors coming from these women's medical schools. You know, it was very, very progressive.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I should have announced this earlier, but if anyone in the audience has a question, feel free to type it in the chat box. A few other, till we get some chats, let's see here. If we get anything, I will be glad to read them out to you, but a few other things. One of the themes that people in medicine of any gender or background or interest talk so much about these days is mentorship. And there was one quote that just profoundly struck me. You know, sometimes it's been a struggle even in this day and age to find meaningful mentorship. But one quote you have here is, consider how women stand in this matter, how alone, how unsupported, no libraries, museums, hospitals, dispensaries, clinics, no endowments, scholarships, professorships, prizes to stimulate and reward study, no recognized position, et cetera, et cetera. One can hardly conceive a more complete isolation. You know, the things these women put themselves through willingly to achieve a goal that was important to them and became important to other women patients, future women physicians, et cetera, is just incredibly inspiring.
They were really going with nothing. Basically, they
Yeah.
were trying to go, storm storm the gates of the establishment, right? Because that's where the teachers were. That's where the money was. Like the men's medical schools had all the stuff. They had the libraries, they had the professors, they had the tools, they had the lectures. And when they wouldn't let them in, instead of waiting, they're like, well, fine, we'll just do it ourselves. So they had to build it all again from the ground up on their own with nothing. They're begging and pleading for money from people to build, a hospital, build a medical school of their own. And it's just crazy what they achieved. I know there's a lot of discussion to be had as the quality of the education that some of these early schools are providing, but I think at any medical school at the time, it's just a few months of training. It's not. But that to me was the craziest thing when I was learning about like these people just went to medical school for a few months and they're like, all right, you're a doctor. So the men could graduate without ever having delivered a baby. So they're, going to a delivery as a doctor, and like this is their first time. They're probably really traumatizing this person. But yeah, they really had to want it, right? You definitely, could not have blamed them one bit for quitting at any point. Hearing any of these stories, like, okay, yeah, that would have been the end of it for me, right? I would have just been, okay, fine, I'll go do something else. But they really, their persistence was absolutely incredible in what they achieved at the end of it.
Well, I think the other thing that resonated to me, even beyond medicine, in this day and age where there's so much contentiousness in the world about everything, it feels like, I marveled at how tranquil, professional, brave they were to, present themselves for dinner at their enemies' houses, to march through drunken masses of people hurling projectiles at them and just go about their business and be the incredible best that they could be.
Yeah, they had to literally have dinner with the enemy. Like they had to face these men in person. It wasn't, there was no hiding behind a screen. There was no, just writing letters. They would literally go into these men's offices and say, hey, I need you to let me into this class, or hey, I'm gonna do this. Whether just knowing the kind of seething like misogyny that was below the surface of this person. But yeah, I cannot imagine, some of these situations that they put themselves in. Yes, definitely. It was unimaginable for sure.
And yet, their ability to maintain that calm demeanor and professionalism really did advance their cause rather than being reactionary. And I think that was maybe the difference between Sophia, as you were describing earlier. She was a little more bombastic and maybe adversarial sometimes. So it's, I don't know, maybe a lesson to us in other realms, even beyond medicine.
Yeah, she was such a character. But I think that if they had fought back, if they had done anything to defend themselves, it would have just blown up in their faces, right? And they knew that. That's what, in so many situations, women have to calculate so many more things, right? They have to like be 4 steps ahead of, well, if I do this, what's going to happen then, right? And what I think really surprised a lot of the men who were perpetrating these riots was that the press ended up really turning on them. And these women were really masterful in using these episodes to say, would you want your daughter going to see a man that would do something like this as a doctor? Like this isn't what we want as physicians for our families. Can you imagine? This is why we're doing this. These horrible men are literally the reason that we need women doctors, so they really are kind of masters at turning these horrible experiences into a win for the movement, basically.
Mm-hmm. Let's see here. I don't have anything in the chat room. And like I said, I could talk to you all afternoon very happily, but I know that everybody has more clinical duties this afternoon. So I thought I would end this talk with a quote from your author's note. You said, holding letters and notes handwritten by these women was truly electrifying and helped me connect to them and their lives. I hope I have done them justice. And I certainly feel very certain in saying that I think that they would be thrilled to be represented to modern society, modern professionals in the way that you have represented them here. Thank you so much for bringing all their stories to finally getting the attention that they all deserve.
Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun to write, honestly. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Certainly my pleasure, and I know our audiences as well, and greatly looking forward to the next book.
Thank you. Me too.
And there are several very nice comments. This was an inspiring and wonderful, et cetera, thank you, amazing talk, etc. So Olivia, thank you so much. This has been such an honor for me, a thrill. So
anytime.
Well, you know, after this next book comes back, I'll be not